press hockey coverage with Jim Biringer.
Hello, everyone. This is a Full Press NHL podcast. I'm your host, Jim Biringer, the voice of Full Press Hockey. I'm joined once again by Bob Duff. You can read him at Detroit Hockey Now. Bob, thank you for coming on during this lull in the offseason.
Yeah, I mean, baseball talks about the dog days of August, but I think there's not a lot of barking going on in the NHL right now either.
I got a quick question before we dive in to the Detroit Red Wings and talk about their offseason last year. I brought this up during free agency, and I've kind of been starting to get some momentum with some people I've talked to about this, pushing the start of free agency back past the Canadian and U.S. holidays, maybe August 1st, we should start doing free agency.
Well, I'm all for getting it away from July 1st being a Canadian. I've never been able to celebrate Canada Day my whole career, so it'd be nice, when all my friends are going off and having parties and fireworks, and I'm slogging on a phone and a computer all day trying to see what the latest move is. It's very frustrating as a Canadian to have one of your biggest holidays of the year just taken away from you by the NHL.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. I mean, usually it dies down before the July 4th holiday, but even still, I think if we move it away, maybe we don't get this lull in the offseason that we've seemed to have gotten since the second week of July.
And I think, they tried for a couple of years, I think it was, where they actually gave the teams a window where they could talk to players before the signing period opened. And I don't know, maybe if you give them the first 2 weeks of July even to just kind of, talk to have, both sides get to talk and see what's out there. And then on the 15th, say you start the signing period. And I just think, to me, that would be a better system where you as a player, you could kind of gauge what's out there for you, and you don't, have to be afraid I got to jump on this offer right away because it might not be there tomorrow. And as a team, if you lose this guy, at least this guy's interested. A better gauge on, what you can and can't do. And I think that would help a lot of teams and probably make life a little less stressful for the players that are dealing with free agency, because I've talked to, even big name players who go through this, and they say, that even if it's only a few hours, that few hours where you don't have a job is very stressful.
No, I can imagine that. And the fact of the matter is we all know everybody talks, but that actually have like a winter meetings or a summer meetings or a summer talking period would definitely solve some of these problems that we have right now.
And I would get it away from the draft. I mean, it's just they're just banging into each other now. Like you need that decompression period after the draft before you have to jump. Like it's so insane. You go from the draft to free agency to development camp. Like the last 2 years, development camp's been going on while free agency has been starting. And it just seems like, you should be doing whatever you can to keep your sport in the news. So to have it all going on at once is just counterproductive.
No, I agree with that. And the fact of the matter is maybe it'll help with getting the draft centralized again if we move everything away from July 1st and, move everything around, because we know that the draft is decentralized, and the GM in Detroit seems to like the decentralized draft.
Yeah, anything that can keep Steve Yzerman away from the media, he's all in favor of
it. Speaking of the Detroit Red Wings, good segue here. Missed the playoffs again last year. Had a stretch there. Changed the coach. Todd McCullough comes in. You had that back-to-back with Columbus. We had the Stadium Series, kind of a turning point in that season. If they get those games against Columbus, maybe they make the playoffs. But everything after that kind of went downhill. Not a lot of moves at the deadline either. You heard the captain come out and say it was kind of a morale killer in the room, that Steve Yzerman didn't do too much. A lot of pressure on this team coming into this season?
I think so. I mean, I think you have to look back to last year. They were dealing with such a fine line because they dug themselves such a deep hole under Derek Lalonde before they made the change. Like, I was kind of surprised they went out to California and had a winless trip in November, and I thought that would have been the time to make the move where you could still salvage your season before you buried yourself. But they went another, pretty good another month, maybe even longer, before they finally decided to make the move. And by then they were, 8-9 points out of the playoffs, and with overtime and shootout points. Now that's the fact that they got back into it is a tremendous credit to them, but they just couldn't afford any more downturns. You had to keep winning every night, and they just weren't good enough to keep that going for 40, 50 games.
One of the big moves this offseason, I guess you could say the biggest move, is another goaltender comes into the fold. John Gibson's acquired by the Detroit Red Wings. You hope that the third time's a charm in Detroit, because the other two have not panned out the way the moves you would have hoped. Was it Nedeljkovic first, and then Ville Husso, and now obviously John Gibson? Is there a belief that Gibson can be the guy that he was in Anaheim and propel this team into the playoffs?
Yeah, I think they're hoping he'll play about close to 50 games, and then Cam Talbot will play the other 32. I think what they found with Talbot last year, that he was very good, but at his age, it's hard for him to sustain it over 7, 8, 9 games in a row. He needs a break. He can't. I don't know that at 38 can you be the guy that is going to play 50, 55 games, and I don't think he is anymore. I think he's still a very good goalie, and in that role, I think he'll be effective. Now, the question is going to be Gibson, because let's face it, he has had some injuries in his career. Now, is his inconsistent seasons, was it due to the injuries? Or I think last year he had a pretty good year, but the previous two, he didn't have a great year, and he was also on a bad team, but he's coming to a team that isn't great either. So, there's a lot of what ifs, but I think it's an upgrade on what they had. There's no doubt about that. It's still a question mark of how much of an upgrade will it be.
You talked about down the stretch and then burying yourself in a hole down, those points that they were able to rally in. Big factor coming down the stretch to me, what I watched from the outside, maybe you can dive deep into this a little bit more, was the play of Marco Kasper. It seemed they put him into the offense a little bit more. He was driving play. They allowed him to be that player that they drafted, and it seemed to help the team offensively. Am I wrong on that?
No, he's definitely probably the most pleasant surprise last year. I mean, they knew he was an NHL player. I don't think anybody in hockey thought he was going to be this productive offensively. I mean, that was the big question mark. We talked to a lot of scouts about him, and they all said this guy's going to play in the NHL for a long time, but he's probably going to be at best a 40-point guy. Now, that's about what he got last year. I think he ended up with 37, 19 goals, but he only played like 55, 60 games. So, he projects over that to be at least a 60-point guy, which is more than anyone was expecting from him offensively. What I worry about with him is, because he was so effective last year, are the expectations on him this year just going to be ridiculous? Like, there's people thinking he's going to score 30 goals and, flirt with 80 points. And I think that's just too much to ask for him, certainly at this age. Like, let the kid, if you get another 19 goals out of him this year, you should be pretty happy.
Yeah, no, I would think so too. It just seemed like Detroit seemed to find their mark when he got going, played in the right situations, because it seemed like they weren't sure where to put him in the lineup. And then once they got him going, and it feels like he's a valuable piece of this team moving forward, because, it feels like, Detroit wants to make moves, but teams want that player, but they don't want to give him up.
Yeah, well, he's untouchable. There's no doubt about that. And I think a lot of deals that the Wings talked with teams about, both at the deadline and in the summer, that was the first name the other teams were asking about, and the answer was no, because you put him on any line and he drives that line. When he was on the wing with Larkin and Raymond, that was probably the best that line played all season. And then when they put him between Kane and DeBrincat, they seemed to rediscover that chemistry they had in Chicago, because now they had a center, that was driving the line. And the problem with Kane and DeBrincat was they couldn't find a center to play with them where it all clicked. And it seemed to really click with Kasper. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they balance the top six this year, because they still need someone to play with Larkin and Raymond. And I don't think James Van Riemsdyk can be that guy on a consistent basis again at his age. I think once in a while he can play up there, but I don't think you want him on your top line every night, every game. So they still don't have that guy to play with those two. Now, do you move DeBrincat in there, and then, you affect the chemistry of the second line, which was so effective when those three were all together. And in fact, when they tried to do that late in the season, when they moved the Brinkat up to the top line, it hurt the second line. They weren't as effective. And, the other possibility, and they tried it briefly at the end of the season, Jonathan Berggren on the top line. Now, are they ready to give him that role? They still have question marks about his defensive play. And, let's face it, Raymond and Larkin are not A-listers when it comes to defensive hockey. So you have three guys on your top line that you don't really implicitly trust defensively.
No, I don't think that's something Tom McCollum would want with three guys not playing. I mean, they all could play somewhat defense, but to not have them be like Sasha Barkov level. Yeah, I don't know if I'm running those three guys out there, especially when the game's on the line. But look, Detroit to me is fascinating because they've been in that group with the Buffaloes and the Ottawas. And then you saw last year Montreal, because of how weak the Eastern Conference was and teams slipped, they kind of passed the Red Wings in their development. And, we're going, 9 years now, no playoffs, potentially 10 years. I mean, playoffs got to come back to Hockey Town eventually. And does that – I don't want to start speculation here or, fuel rumors about like Yzerman and his job or anything like that. But does it feel like there could be a tide that could turn if they miss again?
If they miss spectacularly, like if there's a real downturn in their performance, I think there could be an issue there. But I don't think, with who he is and what he's accomplished with his organization and how respected and even beloved he is by the Ilitch family, I think he'll get a lot more rope than most GMs will, and probably already has. But I think things would have to bottom out and really start, if they just are never in the playoff race at all, and it looks like it's going to, the team has really regressed, then I think that would be an issue. But, you have to also look at, I look at the Tigers as an example. Fans wanted Al Avila run out of town as the GM of the Tigers for years and screamed and yelled and moaned, and they finally did it. Well, now you look at the team with all these guys that Al Avila brought in, and they're the best, they've been flirting with being the best team in baseball this year. And you start looking at the first-round picks of Yzerman that are on the team now. All of them are impact players. So you can't knock his drafting. You can certainly knock his free agent and trading moves. Trades, he's probably been a mixed bag. Free agency, the same thing. And last year, certainly it was a disaster in both categories. Like all the guys they traded for at the deadline aren't coming back this year. And the free agents they signed, they've already got rid of Tarasenko. Gustafsson they're bringing back, but he's going to be battling for a third pairing role. And the main reason he's coming back is he can help the power play. But none of the moves they made last year panned out for them, and that was one of the reasons why they missed the playoffs. So I think there's that factor, but you also have to look, and people don't have a real appreciation for history or remember what happened 5-10 years ago. But when he arrived here, it was ground zero. They had nothing. Ken Holland's drafts the last probably 5, 6, 7, maybe even 10 years. Dylan Larkin was really and Berggren are the only players they got out of that. For a whole, you look around at the guys they took in that span, that nobody helped them, and you can't keep not getting anybody in the draft and expect the team to be good. Like, he came here. You go back and look at that 1920 Red Wings roster, and it was a scary bunch. Like, oof. It was not a fun team to watch at all. And then it's just, when you're at that level where you've got nothing. I mean, he had to take some swings on guys. You're hoping, he took a lot of guys that had been first-round picks for other teams to try to see if, was there something there? Because obviously at some point in their career, hockey people thought there was, or they wouldn't have been taken in the first round. Like guys like old Hugh Levy was one they brought in, and Brendan Perlini. They kept bringing in these guys that had been first-round picks elsewhere to see if there was anything there. And, for the most part, there wasn't. And they took their lumps because of that. I wonder, too, if maybe he should have just sucked it up and been really bad for like 3 or 4 years and got a bunch of really high picks and hope, maybe you you hit the lottery and get a Connor Bedard or a Macklin Celebrini, and your team's a lot better off. I mean, that's the one thing they don't have is that, that franchise difference maker guy. They have a lot of good players, but they don't have the real guy that's gonna take you to the promised land, kind of, the Crosby or the McDavid, that type of player. And, granted, they don't come along every year, but with their, they've had bad lottery luck. There's no doubt about that. But considering that, the guys he's found, picks 4 and 6, and I think Red Wings fans were appalled when he took Moritz Seider there because nobody knew who he was. But now he's probably, if not the most beloved Red Wing, he's certainly in the top 2 or 3. So, the guy's done a lot of good things here. I mean, it hasn't turned into a playoffs yet, but, half the teams in the league don't get in the playoffs.
No, that's a fair point. And I mean, they were I believe the year before last year's free agency, I think they lost because of tiebreakers with Washington. Like they had same points, but they were there without getting in, but it was regulation wins. And you mentioned Tarasenko. I never understood the signing last year. Like if it was a 1-year deal, I'd have been like, okay, you take a chance, a flyer on a guy who's won a cup. But the 2-year deal was like, is Tarasenko really going to be here for 2 years? And obviously we see he moved them out pretty quickly after a year.
Yeah, I think, they would never admit this, but I think it was a bit of a panic move because they were in on Stamkos, and at one point I think they thought they had him. And then he ended up signing with Nashville, and by then David Perron had already signed with Ottawa. So now they were scrambling. They knew they needed goal scoring, and there wasn't much on the table, and they took a flyer. And I think that's one of the reasons why they didn't take any flyers this year because, can you keep bringing in these, longer in the tooth veterans hoping they've got one more good year left in them? And for the most part, they don't. I mean, they wouldn't still be sitting there on July 3rd or 4th if they had a lot of mileage still in the tank. So I think this year, it wasn't a great free agent crop in terms of depth. And he basically decided to just sit it out, really. They didn't make any moves. The problem is they've got, they had 3 glaring weaknesses they needed to address going into the offseason. They needed to get a legit number 1 goalie. They filled that need with Gibson. They still need, as we talked about, a guy to play on the wing on the top line. They have not filled that need. And they were hoping to land a top 4 defenseman. They had I think they were hoping for either Ekblad or Gavrikov. And, Ekblad nobody got a shot at Ekblad. He stayed in Florida. And Gavrikov, basically, they knew he was going to the Rangers almost from the get-go. And, as much as I asked Steve this myself, I said, do you think players still don't look at this as a destination they want to come to? And he said he didn't think they did. But we heard, Nicola Ehlers wouldn't even take their phone calls.
Yeah, so, I mean, winning matters, right? You still have to win. That's why guys want to go play in Florida and Tampa. Now guys want to go sign in Montreal. Like, they see there's a bright future ahead and the team's winning. That's why guys want to go play in certain spots. And, yeah, I think that doesn't help. And maybe it's just, again, social media and some media hype around the Larkin Yzerman kind of interaction in the media kind of comments there with everything that happened. But, I listened to what Steve had to say this year, especially at the trade deadline and then get a free agency. Talked about having, pieces to move, but the right deals weren't there. And I guess, as you said earlier, the right deal does not involve Marco Kasper.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I wonder about, he's followed the same blueprint that Ken Holland did, where they let their prospects ripen. But I'll give him credit. He has moved guys in when he felt they were ready. Like Kasper come in early last year, like in November. And the year they brought Edmondson in the year before when they were fighting for the playoffs. So they have put guys in. And I think the one real difference you see with McLellan over Lalonde is McLellan is willing to give some rope to the younger guys, whereas Lalonde just did not want to play the younger guys. He wanted to, I think they left Jonathan Bergeron another year too long, in my opinion, in Grand Rapids, just because they knew Derek Lalonde wasn't going to play him if he was going to play. So what's the point of him sitting in the press box every night when you need, at that age, they need to be playing. So that's why I say I wonder if they should have gone the Ottawa and Montreal route where you put these young guys in the lineup quicker. You take your lumps, you lose, but they're learning on the job instead of, waiting 3 years to get there after they get to Grand Rapids. And would they be further ahead right now had they done that with some of these guys? We'll never know because they didn't, but you wonder if they're going to try. Like, they have left some openings this year where young guys, if they come in and have a good camp, could make, is Nate Danielson ready? Everything I've heard is he's not, but he could end up in a situation like Kasper where he starts in Grand Rapids and maybe by November he's played himself into Detroit's lineup. And, you look at the rest of their guys right now, it's hard to see anybody on, that played in Grand Rapids last year or is coming in from there's a lot of curiosity about Edwards Trollmox, who they've signed as a free agent after he led the Czech league in scoring. But it sounds like the plan for him is he's going to start in Grand Rapids. And, Jakub Rajkowski, who came over last year after leading the Czech league in goals, was hurt most of the year and had to have surgery. So we still don't know what he has to offer. So there's another guy that, that's down there that, are they going to be a factor or not? We don't know. So there is, right now they've only got 7 NHL defensemen, and traditionally the Wings have always carried 8. So, they re-signed William Lagesson. Is he going to be the 8th defenseman again like he was last year and basically spent most of the season watching the games from the press box? You'd rather have him doing that than a kid like a William Wallander or a Shai Boom, or, they need to still be playing. And so if they're not going to be playing in the NHL, they need to be playing in the AHL. But, it's hard to be patient when you're a fan and your team hasn't been in the playoffs for 9 years.
Yeah, you don't want to get into that Buffalo territory of missing for 14, 15 years, and you almost feel like you're irrelevant once the season begins. A guy I wanted to ask you about, Axel Sandin-Pellikka. Is that a guy that potentially could have a chance to make the team?
I think he'd have to have a pretty monster camp. I saw him playing in Grand Rapids at the end of last season and into the Calder Cup playoffs. And he looked like, he wasn't ready. He was still making the adjustment to North American ice and that. And it was funny. He kind of almost complained about the way they play hockey over there. They don't let you use your skill. You just throw the puck out of the zone. That's basically what he said, to paraphrase him, what he said. And I think, he's also a smaller guy, so he probably needs to add some strength before he gets to becoming an NHL regular, but I don't think he's that far away. He might, one season in GR, or maybe even by the end of this season, he'll be up. The guy that I think might have a shot is Brandsegg Nygaard, because I watched him in Grand Rapids too, and every game he got significantly better. It's like he grasps things and picks things up quickly, and that was also what we heard from his Swedish coaches, that he's a guy that he learns fast on the job, and he's a big body and he knows how to use a big body. And, he's played really well for Norway the last 2 years in the World Championships against NHL players. So he's a guy that I'm kind of curious about to see. I think if he had a really good camp, he might start next season with the Wings.
A couple of things. I saw a couple articles dropped that you had. We're talking about Erik Karlsson, Nazem Kadri's names have come out, mentioned the Wings. But do you really see fits with those two players on that team? I mean, it doesn't feel like Kadri's going anywhere, but it seems like Karlsson and Detroit always seem to come up.
Yeah, I just don't see the fit with Karlsson, partially because of the salary, but mostly because, at this stage of his career where he's going to help a team, mostly is going to be on the power play. And the Red Wings had a tremendous power play last year. So why would you want to mess with that? I think their problem is 5-on-5 goals, and I still don't know where they're going to get 5-on-5 goals this year, because they really didn't bring other than Van Riemsdyk. But again, he's a guy that has pretty much made hay on the power play. Like, he's not going to score, I don't think, a lot of 5-on-5 goals. So I just don't see, and then from Karlsson's viewpoint, why would he want to come here? Like, if you're at this stage of your career, don't you want to try to win the Stanley Cup? And you don't want to go to a team that, even if they made the playoffs, they're still probably, quite a few years away from where you could say they were a cup contender.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, for sure. I mean, like you said, 5-on-5 goals seem to be an issue for Detroit. I mean, they're going to have to rely on the big guns there. Lucas Raymond's going to have to take another step. I've always loved that kid since the day Detroit drafted him. I thought that was a great pick. I didn't know much, like you said, when Mo Sider was drafted. I was like, they're going. I hadn't seen the kid play since World Juniors. I was like, and now you could see why. And you mentioned the drafting and developing and Stamkos situation. I think the big thing was like in Tampa with Steve Yzerman, you had the points coming, you had the Kucherovs, the triplets, everybody was coming. It seems like that's what he's doing in Detroit, and you want to see that next wave. Obviously, Tampa's on a different level than Detroit because you already had Stamkos and Hedman there and Vasilevsky, yeah. But it feels like he's getting that part of the equation right again.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big thing when people talk about how quickly they got it going in Tampa. Like you say, they had Hedman and Stamkos in place. It's kind of like arriving in Detroit and having prime Steve Yzerman and prime Nick Lidstrom. yeah, we can build around these guys.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think, and where do you see the progression for Detroit this season?
I think they're going to have a hard time making it. I think, I see them at best probably being in the low 90 points. I don't think they're going to, there was certainly they were a better team under Todd McLellan, and you're kind of curious to see what a full year under him is going to look like. Because the one thing about him that I think was an eye-opener for the players was that he demands accountability from everyone. And there were several times where he would just, if he wasn't happy with the tempo or the attention span in practice, he would just stop practice and he would read him the riot act. And, the famous quote that he said early on when he just said, just play hockey. You've been doing it your whole life, And he seems to have an ability to get the most out of his players, but I still just, you look at around the East and, someone's got to fall out that made it last year. And you start looking at Montreal, to me, I think will be better because, they're going to have more young talent this year. Demidov for the whole season, probably, And Ottawa, they did what I said. They put the young guys in. They took their lumps. And they obviously think they're further along than the Red Wings because they've made a couple bold trades in the last year or so that the Wings didn't make because they gave up. They gave up a Josh Norris, who's a proven NHL goal scorer. The Red Wings aren't willing to do that, and partially because they just don't have enough depth of prospects that they can afford to give one away. So it seems like Ottawa and Montreal have both passed the Wings in terms of where they are in the rebuild. And you start looking around, like Tampa Bay is not going to be what they were, but they're still, I can't see them missing the playoffs.
Right.
And you look around, like maybe Washington regresses. I don't know. At some point you got to figure the wheels come off Ovechkin scoring 40 goals till he's 60, can he?
I mean, maybe as somebody that I did radio with the other day, he breaks the other leg and puts up 40. I mean, just even it out. But no, I think to me, teams to watch, like Columbus is a team to watch, like the rivalry there. Like those games were kind of must win for Detroit, and last year they weren't able to. Like the games that they really need to win or the breaks they need to get, they're not getting on the way to the playoffs right now. And I think they have to start winning those closer games and figure out a way to just stick with their system, which will allow them to win those tighter games.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of, the maturity of a team, that they've got to show that they've, they talk about learning lessons and the failures, but now you got to show that you've learned those lessons and go out and instead of failing, succeeding. And, it's a lot of guys, they basically are counting, other than Van Riemsdyk, they're counting, amongst the players, not including the goaltenders, they're counting on growth from within. They're expecting Bergeron to be better. They're expecting Kasper to be better. They're expecting Albert Johansson with a full season as a regular will be better. Like he's probably back in, I think they were feeling if they could get another top four defenseman, then Johansson would probably play in the third pair. But now he's probably back in the top pair. And then the other question they've got to answer is, do you run Sherratt back in the top pairing with Seider, or do you go Edmondson Seider in the top pairing? They tried that at the start of last year, and I think they felt they were putting a little too much responsibility on Edmondson, in what was basically his first NHL season. So we'll see if they think he's grown to where he can handle that role, and you play the two studs together maybe. But, the problem with that I see is like both Seider and Edmondson like to go with the puck. So you can't have two guys that want to go with the puck. So I think that's why he's a good fit with Johansson, because Johansson's happy to fill that role where he's the guy that stays responsible and lets Edmondson be a little more creative. But even that, you look at Albert Johansson's goals last year, only got 3 of them, but they were all spectacular.
Yeah, no, they were great. I loved watching the kid. Like, I love the talent they have on this team. It's just, okay, it's time. Like, for me, I look at the progression, and it's like, yeah, I understand the rebuild, the retool. Okay, it takes time after having and paying a price. There's always paying a price for success, especially 25 years and making the playoffs. Like, I get it. I understand it. But you said it before. Like, if maybe they just let the kids play, maybe they're a little further along to the point where, like, yeah, we believe in Detroit this year that they can do it.
And the other thing that we don't know is, what kind of pressure or expectations is ownership putting on them. I know when they were nearing the end of the playoff run, there was pressure from above to keep making the playoffs, which, in retrospect, probably didn't help them any in the long run, because they were trading away prospects to get, veterans to push them back into the playoffs for one more year. But, some of those guys they trade away, like Kalle Järnkrok and Matthias Janmark, they might not be NHL stars, but they're still in the NHL.
Yeah. Yeah, they're good players. They've been on, Matthias Janmark's been in the Stanley Cup final, so you can't say he isn't a good NHL player, and that's sometimes, that is a price you have to pay. But hopefully for Detroit's sake, they can get back, at least be competitive this year. And if they fall short, they fall short. But hopefully, again, I think the big thing for me to watch, and we can end this here, is what they do heading into the deadline, especially if they're close to just maybe this is the year to push them in.
Yeah, they do have a lot of young players, and that's what teams seem to want at the deadline, teams that are looking to move a veteran out. So at some point, if they're going to probably have to give one of them up. And there are some that they would be willing to give up, but not the ones that the team won't. It's like, this isn't like the people think it's like fantasy sports where you get together with your buddies and I'll give you the 3 players I hate for the 2 guys you hate. That's not how it works in the NHL.
No, it's like, all right, well,
it would work that way. Like, I'm sure every GM would love to give away all the players he hated to some other team, but that's just not the way it works.
Yeah, it's like, all right, yeah, well, I'll give you Comfer and somebody else for 2 guys you don't. It's like, no, it's not. That's why those deals haven't happened. Teams don't want to take on those contracts. They want the big name free agent. They want their big young guys, and that's why the moves aren't being made. But hopefully, Dylan Larkin stays healthy, and if he stays healthy, this team, to me, the offense drives through him, and then he can put the team on his back. And similar to what we saw with Nick Suzuki, he can go to ownership and management and say, no, it's time to make a move because, team's with us.
Yeah, there's a lot of, if a lot of things go right for them, they should be right there in the hunt again. But there's also the potential for a lot of things, not necessarily go wrong, but just, guys don't progress as quickly as they're hoping.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So it's going to be an interesting year in Detroit with the Red Wings. Hopefully, Tigers continue to do their thing in Detroit too. At least there's one winner right now.
Well, between the Tigers and the Lions, and then even with the Pistons making the playoffs last year, one advantage the Wings have had is there's been a lot of distractions around the pro sports scene that people aren't completely focused on them not getting there. They've had other options that have, given them some joy.
Absolutely. So, Bob, thank you so much for doing this today, taking some time out of your schedule. I know all the off season's here, but glad that we know hockey's right around the corner.
Yeah, it's not far away. Kevin and I were talking about that today. He's in a month or so, rookie camp and all that. It's just, it still seems like summer just started.
I know, right? It feels like it. But Full Press NHL podcast, guys. Bob Duff, get him at Detroit Hockey Now. Also, like he said, Kevin Allen's there as well. Get this iTunes, Spotify, where you get your podcast. Also up on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel as well. Jim Biringer alongside Bob Duff. Guys, take it.
Full Press Hockey Coverage with Jim Biringer.